Many people have said that we've lived at least 2,000 years and maybe longer with the notion that we don't really belong in this world. We find ourselves in this world, but this isn't the place of our true belonging. Now, of course, many have taken that very literally. They have taken it as the notion that we are on a pilgrimage through this life, and the end of that pilgrimage is to have reached, some of course have called it the kingdom of heaven. Others call it eternity. Certainly the notion of a higher realm. And many have talked about the journey of life in that way. Others, however, have thought that that can only be a metaphorical notion. There's no other world that we could actually attain. No such place exists. But the notion that our place of true belonging is elsewhere is an important metaphor, a metaphor that helps us not get too entrenched in the everyday and ordinary affairs of this life. And as we'll see as we go further along, philosophers have argued over whether to understand our having a place of true belonging as a literal notion, a metaphorical notion. They've even been concerned as to whether even as a metaphorical notion it can make sense for us. Does it make sense to think of life as a journey, and that somehow this world is a place that we have in some way to reorient ourselves in, to find a way, at least metaphorically, to transcend? These become pressing issues. Well, as we've seen matters so far, the grand vision held with qualifications. But when we came to Schopenhauer, and as we've now come to look at Karl Marx, that vision of our belonging to some beyond, whether literal or metaphorical, is now brought into deep question. It's as if we primarily are in this world, and in Marx's case, it's really where we belong, and we've got to change this world here to make it a world in which we can experience fully that belonging. Let's continue now on this strange adventure that we're engaged in. This axial notion that we're in, but not altogether of the world, obviously suggests three possible strategies with respect to our relation to the world. Transcending it, being resigned to it, or maybe transforming it. And maybe that transformation would be the important thing, whether revolutionary or through gradual progress. After all, the notion of revolution, which we're going to be looking at in Marx, isn't the only way in which we might change the world in which we find ourselves. We could do it with gradual improvements. There are numerous ways it could be done. But let's keep in mind as we go forward that the notions that we're looking at now in Marx have next to nothing to do with some alleged other world. They have to do nearly altogether with how we can transform this world into a place where we can be at home. Of course, the notion of transcendence has played an important, even in a way, a primary role in our Western history. That's partly because of the Greek preference for theory over practice. The idea that what really is the highest and enhancing thing we can do is theorize and speculate about ideas. And what we begin to see strongly in Marx is the idea that it's practice, not only that is important and central, but it's actual practice, living and working in the world, that is the place that whatever salvation we may attain would be attained. And that salvation isn't a deliverance from the world, it's making the world over into a place where we can be complete, where we can be full, where we can have the completion possible to us. the very configuration that the tradition has given us through Plato of the soul encourages the idea of theory, that theory is really what matters, speculation. Marx, as we're seeing, tips that upside down, says theories, ideas, they arise from the very concrete circumstances in which we are living our lives and are always going to be enmeshed. Now, Marx is a great critic of religion, and his criticisms are important, but we have to understand first what he's criticizing before we look too much further into the criticisms themselves. There's the Christian notion, for example, that the kingdom is not of this world, and that's had a consequence too on Western thinking. One thing it's done is put philosophy in the service of considerations of faith. And that became a kind of watershed moment in Western philosophy. Hegel, in fact, for all of his talk, said that he was a religious philosopher. And what he was doing was using philosophical ideas to illustrate, to articulate the real meaning for sophisticated, educated people of what faith was. That Hegel was, in a way, using philosophy to support religion. But let us be very clear about this. Hegel might have said that. There might have been the view that philosophy, if said in a certain way, would be sophisticated, subtle, deep religion for educated people. But as you can imagine, there's another account that emerges. And that account is that philosophy is quite separate from religion. It can be a utopian. It can give us a grand picture of another realm, maybe not a literal realm after death, but a realm of ideas or forms or realities that only the philosophical mind can reach. That's something we could consider as possible. What's important to see in Marx is that Marx thinks that that doesn't add up. One of Marx's kind of strong notions is that religion as we've known it, it's an opiate, an opium for the people. It's something that you give them to get their minds off the fact that they are being exploited. What Marx says, in effect, is that you can abuse, you can exploit, you can completely, in effect, suck the very everyday meaning, talent, expression of talent, life out of people, and they're likely to take it if you tell them that the things of this world don't matter anyway. The best things in life are free. After all, God loves you, and blessed are the meek, because they inherit the earth. And don't worry that nothing's coming to you now, because the poor are the loved ones and the cherished ones in heaven. If religion isn't literally true, if it's possible that there's a philosophical religion, it's also possible that Marx is onto something. And that's something we have to think about. Does Marx promise us a world that can really be changed here and now? No, but he's going to tell us how to bring it about and hope that will work out. But Marx does tell us not, absolutely not, to take seriously the claims of religion if those claims say we're going to be looking toward another world. And if philosophy says think primarily about ideas, Marx is going to say don't take that too seriously either. Now, a further consequence of making philosophy as a guide to transcendence is that philosophy then can become cultish, and it can become, in effect, an esoteric pursuit. It can be a way of getting away from the serious life we live in the world. Marx dismisses that as well. One of the consequences of the Enlightenment did turn out to be the submerging of otherworldliness and the emergence of philosophy from out of the control of theological concerns. Marx very much saw that. He was an antagonist toward religion, but he was also antagonistic toward philosophy if it was just free from religion, but then free simply to spin out ideas. And even in the 19th century with Marx, as the world came increasingly to be understood scientifically, axial instincts decreased. Ideas that we could transcend the world, that we could find a beyond, they decreased because of scientific progress. And the very notion of transcending the world got changed into the notion that what you would really do then was simply live a life of the mind, of ideas, live an artistic and aesthetic life. Well, if not transcendence, what about resignation? Resignation has been a strategy to deal with the human predicament, the human situation. It's been a dominant strategy, and some people have identified it with philosophy itself, being philosophical about things. Even Socrates, Hellenistic thought, believed that no harm came to a good person, and thus that goodness is a matter of character. Resign yourself to what happens in the world. What happens in the world is of no great importance. Resignation is just to accept the world and cultivate the inner life. Marx says that too is escapism, it's cowardice, it's an inability to understand that if you resign yourself to the way things are, then the one life you might have had, you won't ever be able to have, because resignation is retreat. Resignation is a kind of amputation of underlying human possibility. Deontological, ethical systems have themselves also been resignation modes. We looked at one in Kant, emphasizing motive, not consequence. On such views, you have pure motives, you do what you ought to do, well then things are as they will be, whatever the consequences, you can live with those consequences. If you do the right thing, if your motives are right, what happens, happens. And Marx says, no. This idea of purity of motive, that also can be used by the dominant and ruling people, just as much as a notion of another world or philosophy as living in the realm of thought and ideas. The notion that you have a pure heart and pure motives, that can be equally problematic and equally amputate the real human possibilities that you have. Well, we've looked at that notion of renunciation in Schopenhauer, the idea that life is a disease and the cure is to be resigned and renounce and not live with the difficult pleasures, pains that it has. We know that Schopenhauer rejects reality, and in that sense he's kind of nihilistic. What Marx tells us is that we've got to accept, to change, to live fully in the world, and make the changes in that world that are necessary. Not like Schopenhauer, resign from the world because life is a disease. No, a living fully in the world, and if the world does not meet up with what our human needs are, that are social, that are productive, then we take what risks we have to take to alter and change that world. No deep pessimism. Now, this strategy of resignation lives off in an unstable mixture of beliefs regarding that, well, the inner life can compensate for a bad world, that the actual world isn't significant. And Marx thinks that's a futile attitude. We ought to be celebrating the fruits of the world. What we ought to do is change the world so that those fruits, those opportunities, are not unjustly available to just a privileged few people. What we need to look closely at is philosophical guidance for living, if it involves transforming the world. The meaning of life, Marx thinks, is found in the world itself. And if we do not have access to opportunities in that world to develop a meaningful life, then we will have to transform the world. we will have to make it into a different world. Because after all, our worldly life isn't just external clothing that we wear. We just don't happen to be living in the world. We've got to make that world a home for ourselves that gives us opportunities to express our talents, express who we are. And we have to view human history as potentially progressive, that it can reach a goal, that the world as we know it, if we confront directly the problems about it that repress us and suppress us, that world can thereby be transformed. Marx picks up so many of these ideas from Hegel. Hegel thinks that, as we know, spirit is developed in stages through history. And Hegel thinks that the past stages are ones that have been taken up into a present we can celebrate. Hegel has said ideas matter, they drive history, that history is now complete. But Marx speaks differently. Marx, if we can continue further in following through on his insight or his claim or his mistake, is that he focuses on historical development in a way that is commonly said to turn Hegel upside down. Marx says that history hasn't reached its final stage. He says that we can predict what that stage will be, and if the meaning of our life is in the world, we can even say something about what the world will have to be like for that stage to be reached. Again, Marx thinks it can be predicted, and he thinks that there's a complex of socio-economic forces that are dynamically developing in the world in which we find ourselves. These configure our lives. Ideas that we might reflect on or have spectatorial thought about are merely derivative. Marx thinks that the current stage of the world in which we find ourselves is the penultimate stage of human development. As we saw in the last lecture, he calls it capitalism. And he thinks that it involves comprehensible, traceable distortions of human life, distortions of human consciousness. Because keep in mind, it is Marx's view that how your mind thinks, how you see the world, is a result, a consequence, not a cause of how the world is. Marx thinks that how the world is, that's the cause of the ideas you have and the way in which you think about the world. So, if the meaning of life is to be found through the fulfillment of individuals, and that fulfillment must happen in this world, then we have to look at ways in which this world can and must be changed. Marx thinks he has an account of how this world can and must be changed. And Marx, in this sense, could be called a critic of society who offers a social critique and also a visionary prophet. St. Augustine, many centuries ago, had the notion of a city of God, where people who were true believers could, in a utopian way, over time and history, however sinful they were, eventually achieve the result of transformation and salvation. There is an Enlightenment ideal that was in the 18th century. That ideal was we would use reason, and rationally we would gradually change the world. And perhaps in the notion of globalization today, that same rational utopian hope is to be found. Marx thinks that what we need to do is we need to overcome hunger and poverty. We cannot do this through religion. We can't do it through simply a set of ideas. We have to do it through looking in a cold, hard way at what opportunities the world offers, and we also have to look at how these opportunities are distributed. Marx gives us an account of capitalist society in terms of laws of capitalist commodity production. He thinks that we live our lives in terms of ownership and labor, that there are various property configurations, and resources are disposed in such a way that there are the haves, but also the have-nots. And the world distributes in such a way that the haves have the opportunity, if they take it, and typically they do, to express their talents when and how they want, and that the have-nots do not have these opportunities. They are given ideas or religion, various forms of consolation, but they are not given access to the world in which, as human beings, they must have access to the world if they are truly to become fully human and life can be meaningful for them. This set of historical circumstances, the capitalist sense that Marx thought existed in his time, he thinks very much is the way things now are, and in his mind it's very influenced by something he finds in Hegel, the early Hegel that he loves. It's in a famous section of Hegel's phenomenology called Master and Slave. Hegel says that in our lives we are always in situations involving dominance and subordination, that at least metaphorically there's always a kind of struggle for who will be the dominant one and who will be the subordinate one. Out of that, by the way, we get the politics of recognition in our time, where we're always concerned with recognition and who is the dominant recognizer, who is the subordinate one. Now, Hegel takes that and makes that fundamental to human life. Marx takes it, and Marx says that, well, it actually plays out in a very, very socio-cultural way. It plays itself out in terms of owners, workers, employers, employees, haves and have-nots. And it works out in such a way that some are favored, but most are not. Let us take a moment and think about this. If Marx's count is correct, here's the way it works. And remember now, Marx writes from the 19th century, living in England. Marx says that in the capitalist world, more and more wealth accumulates in fewer and fewer hands. Fewer and fewer people have more and more resource. More and more people have less. And it is Marx's claim that there's a dynamic to the way capitalism works that makes that situation go to an extreme. And if it goes to an extreme, what happens is that with more and more people disenfranchised, having no benefit from the system, deriving nothing from it, being told what to do but not having their talents expressed, revolutionary fervor proceeds. Let's look at this revolutionary fervor further. Does alienation really occur in circumstances where there is an accumulation of wealth in one place and more people do not have opportunity? Well, the mode of thinking, Marx thinks, involved in these circumstances takes on what he calls an ideological cast. What he claims is that in these circumstances, the people on top are always going to find a way to tell a story that's going to make it look like this unfair distribution is okay. They can say things like, the best things in life are free. Don't you worry. What really matters doesn't depend on your socioeconomic circumstances in life. And Marx's claim is in that capitalist world, a false consciousness is developed, We are seduced into thinking that, well, the fact that we are either exploited or not given opportunity doesn't matter. For Marx, philosophical guidance, if we're going to move toward a meaning for our lives, it involves diagnosis. We've got to detect and expose ideology. That is, claims that give us a skewed view of the world, that make us think that situations which are actually in some ways intolerable for us, well, they're livable because those situations aren't where the locus of meaning is found. Marx always wants to diagnose and look at claims about how things are that might make us quiet and passive, that will give us a false consciousness that the world we live in doesn't matter as much as Marx is telling us it must matter, because it's the only place we can live. It's the only place any meaning can be found. Rather than being objectively revelatory or transformative, Marx claims that ideology really masks the interests of the dominant class and presents those interests as reliable accounts of how the world ought to be. Again, Marx thinks that religion is a particularly effective means of distortion. And as I've said earlier, he refers to it as the opiate of the masses. It's a means of crowd control. It's a means of displacing human energy. Because if your concentration is elsewhere, you may not reach and accept the fact that you are at a certain stage of desperation, which can only be overcome if important activity is undertaken to change the world. I've said little about this till I move now to the end of these remarks on Marx. Marx tells us that revolution is required. He tells us it can be predicted because it's in the nature of the unfair distributions in a capitalist society that more and more people are disenfranchised, and this disenfranchisement reaches them to the point where, in utter desperation, having nothing to lose, they will completely revolt. And out of that, Marx thinks, will come what is called a communist society. And in that society, each person will be rewarded in accordance with the needs that person has, and each person will work and act in accordance with the talents that that person has. After the revolution, which is a consequence of circumstances becoming intolerable, when more and more people having less and less, having no stake in the system, jump up finally and revolt. On the other side of that, which, by the way, critics of Marxism often call pie in the sky, by and by, on the other side of that, supposedly we will be liberated. We will be liberated to express our true abilities, and we will be rewarded in terms of our actual needs. Well, difficult situation at best. Difficult because it didn't happen. That is to say, the revolution didn't come as Marx might have thought it would. And we should mention that as a result of its not coming, someone we know a great deal about in the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin, who became for a while, of course, the leader of Russia, what became the Soviet Union, said, these exploited people who aren't finding the meaning of their lives in the world, well, they're not revolting either. And so on Lenin's view, there needed to be some vanguard who would lead them. And that vanguard, Lenin thought, would be the Communist Party. A political party would provide the leadership and the ideas. In passing, note that Stalin thought that that was a great idea, and especially for Russia. Stalin wasn't the internationalist. Lenin was the internationalist. But a vanguard in any case was needed, and it would be a political party. Next, Let us look no longer in the world and its socio-political circumstances. Let us look at the self and its inner dimensions. Let us look at the meaning of life as seen through the ideas, the reflections of Kierkegaard.